According to a debt counselling facility's quarterly report, more South Africans are turning to debt counsellors to help them manage their loans. DebtBusters, one of the biggest debt counselling facilities in the country, has found that in the past 4 years, more consumers with assets such as vehicles and homes are seeking debt counselling. Joining us now from our Sea Point studios is Benay Sager, the Chief Operating Officer of DebtBusters, to talk to us about this exact topic. Good to have you. Thanks very much for being our guest, Benay.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
So your quarterly debt report basically showing that it is not just people with unsecured debt who are finding it hard to make ends meet. Elaborate on this for us.
Yeah, we have been publishing this quarterly report for a number of years now, and we keep track of what happens in the nature of the consumers who apply to us for debt counselling inquiries. What we have seen over the last 4 years, in fact it goes back even further, is the number of people applying for debt counselling and seeking essentially financial freedom in a way has really skyrocketed. It's grown tremendously. And, a lot of us are under big debt stress. We are supporting multiple generations in most cases. And what we're seeing is oftentimes people having to borrow to basically make ends meet every month. And we're seeing the situation actually worsen over the last few years, especially with those people who already have a vehicle or a bond, as we call them, assets.
One of the disturbing parts of your statement, which is quite worrying, basically saying that by the time consumers actually get to the point where they seek help, they need, on average, approximately 67% of their income to actually repay their creditors. Is that an accurate figure?
And unfortunately, that is an accurate figure. I wish I could sit here and tell you that it's not accurate. Unfortunately, it is very accurate. And what we always tell consumers is, if you are taking out a credit and you have to pay it back, of course, if that amount that you're using to pay back to your creditors exceeds more than 40% of your net income, if you can, we would tell them to basically stop. In our minds, that should be the absolute maximum in terms of your net income, share of your net income that you need to spend on paying debt. And what we are seeing is, particularly with some of the higher income brackets, more than 100% is required, which really means that these consumers are unable to repay back their loans. And what happens on the lower end, those with lower income, 5,000 to 7,000 Rand, what we see is that even they need 60 to 70% of their net income to pay back their debt, which is essentially impossible. And what's even worse is with the low income brackets, generally the debts that are taken out have higher interest rates. So it puts the consumers under tremendous pressure. And what we offer is debt counselling. It's a regulated product. It's part of the National Credit Act. And it's not a scary thing. We always urge consumers, if they feel like they're having difficulty in terms of going to sleep, thinking about how they're going to put food on the table, they're worried about paying their kids' school fees, pick up the phone and make an inquiry with debt counsellors like us. Help is just on the other end of the line.
Yeah. I mean, when you do debt counselling, what are the kind of things that you do? I suppose maybe people that have never been through it don't understand what exactly debt counselling is. So I'm going through problems, I phone you. What is the next step? What happens then?
I think with any good debt counsellor, firstly, you have to check that they're registered with the National Credit Regulator. That's quite important. You need to know that you're speaking to a legitimate entity. Then any good debt counsellor should essentially do an assessment with you, telephonically or in person, to really assess your debt based on your credit report, understand your income or any other means that you might have in terms of helping yourself pay back the debts, and do a budget with you. And essentially from that budget, it will be very clear whether you are a good candidate for debt counselling or not. If you are technically, as we call, over-indebted, meaning how much amount you have to pay for your debt and your expenses exceed your income, then you are over-indebted and you do qualify for debt counselling.
Yeah.
And then you have your choice of whether you choose to apply for debt counselling or not. If you choose to apply, then you will fill out an application form, submit with your ID and other documents, And a debt counselor like us will essentially use that to send it to all the creditors that you owe money to, saying this individual has applied for debt counseling and we need to assess whether they're a good candidate. And from that point onwards, you are not allowed to take out new credit, which is very important to help alleviate the stress. Your debt counselor will take care of essentially restructuring your debt, negotiating with all the creditors that you owe money to try to get you to pay your debts over a longer period of time, so that the amount that you would pay on a monthly basis goes down, so that you get an immediate cash flow relief. And the process could take anywhere from 3 years to 5, 6 years sometimes, depending on the level of debt that you have. And during that period, what happens is you pay back one monthly amount to creditors, and it gets distributed. And at the end, you basically come out with what we call a clearance certificate. So it doesn't need to be a scary process, but I think it's important that our consumers go to NCR registered debt counselors, do the budget with the debt counselor over the telephone or in person, and really understand what they're in for.
Yeah. The contributors, I imagine, to the increase of people with assets such as vehicles and homes that need debt counselling, is it as simple as inflation, or is it much more than that? Perhaps maybe overspending or just going above your means?
Often what we see, Leanne, is our consumers are very, very, very stretched. And many of them are supporting multiple generations, in most cases 3 generations. They're supporting their kids, parents, and within the generation they'll support uncles or cousins and so on. All of the South African consumers are extremely stretched, and that's not news. I think you hear that from all of the press reports as well. And often what we see is something unexpected happens that was not provided for. There's a funeral in the family, or there's a medical bill, or one of the income earners loses their job. And all of a sudden, you're left out in the cold. You are doing fine, and tomorrow something happened, and essentially you're not doing fine. You're unable to cope with your debts. That's the most often what we see. We also see what you mentioned, some people taking out more debt, over time, probably stretching themselves beyond their means already. But predominantly, I would say, the consumers that we see would be, especially those with assets, would be the ones who are paying back their bond, paying back their vehicle, doing fine, and all of a sudden something unexpected happened and their financial circumstances changed. And that's where they really need the help.
Your report also shows that people that earn less than 5,000 Rand a month usually actually pay more interest to their creditors. Why is this? Are they seen as higher risks? Do they perhaps go more to loan sharks, and this lands them in problems? What do you attribute it to?
We see the credit report of a consumer only related to NCR registered entities. So these are loan providers, banks, credit providers, and so on. We wouldn't be able to see anything that's essentially not registered with the NCR, like you refer to loan sharks. So this is what's registered with the credit bureaus. And it is true that the average interest rates for lower income would be in the vicinity of 22 to 25% on average, whereas with those with the assets, the average interest rate you would see is somewhere between 14 to 16%. And the reason for this is, as you rightfully say, they have a lower income and they are unable to provide an asset as collateral when they borrow. So therefore, they're seen as higher risk in terms of their ability to repay back. And therefore, they are granted credit, but generally comes at a premium, which is what the higher interest rate actually means. And we see this as the income band goes up, generally there's assets attached to it. Those consumers are able to afford a home loan and a vehicle that is financed. And because of this, the average interest rate drops. From personal loans perspective, generally the average interest rates are still quite high, somewhere between 22 to 25% across all income bands.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for giving us a little bit of advice. Benay Sager, the Chief Operating Officer of DebtBuster, talking to us from our Seapoint studios, really discussing this important fact that more and more South Africans are turning to debt counselling to help them manage their credit. You can do it yourself, and as you heard, it really isn't such a difficult process, but it's something that needs to be done to get you out of that situation.